much less well known and extremely important for the history of the Lied. There are those who believe that he wrote the greatest leader of all, and in certain respects that's true, even when one talks and compares it with Schubert. Wolf was born in Lower Austria, mostly of Germanic background with a little bit of Slovene blood from his mother. Went to the Vienna Conservatory, was a rather difficult, rebellious student there, and so was thrown out, but he resolved to remain in Vienna, which he did the rest of his life. He subsisted basically on cheese, bread, cigarettes, and strong black coffee for the extent of his life. He couldn't afford more than that. He lived where friends were willing to take him in, rather like Franz Schubert did. He tried teaching piano, but that was a disaster because he was so impatient and so difficult. He did become a critic for a paper that wasn't widely known for music, but it was a weekly, and he was very much an ardent champion of Wagner. And in those days, there was a musical war going on, literally, between the progressives of Liszt and Wagner and the conservatives of Brahms and Clara Schumann. You weren't allowed to like one without totally despising the other. And Wolf was the main writer defending Wagner and attacking Brahms. It became quite fascinating in Vienna, and his paper gained much more circulation even as everybody would rush to see what the wild wolf, as they called him, would say next about Brahms. It wasn't a personal thing as much as it was just such a different musical style, because as you can hear from Wolf's harmony, it's very Wagnerian and quite progressive for the times. He wrote some songs that aren't so significant until he was about 27, and actually some of those were published, and it gave him confidence to continue writing. And he came across the poetry of Edward Murica, who was not that well known at that time. And it was as if Wolf was meant for Murica and Murica was meant for Wolf. Murica's poetry, it involves human life. It just takes life in every aspect. And it was tailor-made for Wolf to just take off with. So Wolf, with his usual fanaticism, locked himself away, said he didn't want to see any visitors, no friends. He went out with a gun and shot the birds in the neighborhood so it wouldn't disturb his composing, and literally holed himself up from 6 in the morning till midnight composing. And he basically would write one lead a day, and sometimes even more than that. He said, I don't understand where these are coming from. It just won't stop. And after he'd written 53 of Murica within a space of a month or two, it did stop, very briefly though, because then he turned to Eichendorff. And then he'd written a few Eichendorff songs on the poet Eichendorff before, but he wrote another dozen or so, and then turned to Goethe, and then wrote over 50 of those. And by now, a little less than a year ago, about we had over 100 Lieder. Then he took a little break, and then got inspired by the Spanish Lieder book, which was becoming very popular in Europe at that time. Took 10 sacred ones, set those to music, and 30-some of the secular ones, and then started on Italian translations of Italian poetry. Wrote some of those and suddenly stopped. He said he just lost the ability to write at that time. For the next 5 years, he wrote no Lieder. He was working on an opera, searched for a libretto for a long time, and then rather quickly wrote the opera, but just couldn't do a lead. And then in 1896, when he was 36, he returned and wrote a couple dozen more Italian ones, and then 3 to the poet Reineck, and then 3 Michelangelo sonnets that he set to music. At that point, he was then assigned to an asylum, where he spent the rest of his life for 4 years in a dreadful situation at that point. Looking at his personality, he could be charming when he wanted to. He was always intense, and he was usually very difficult. If singers were premiering his works, he'd stop them in the middle of the performance and correct them and tell them they were no good, and they had to go back to the beginning and start again and curse at them and everything. It was very difficult working with the singers in his opera, so much so that they decided to sabotage its premiere. And yet he had a devoted circle of friends in Vienna, intellectuals who saw his genius and saw this charming side of him that he could also exhibit. So they were the ones who provided him a little cottage to stay or a room in their home. His songs, or his own performance was the same as his personality. It could be wildly intense, it could also be very charming. He always believed that the complete poem should be read first. We're sorry we're not doing that tonight, but we want you to hear lots of variety of Wolf, so we won't read the poems aloud first, but that's what he insisted on. And typical Wolf, at one time, the story goes, as a teenager he was asked to play at a wedding, so he played the March to the Scaffold from Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, at which point the bride collapsed in a swoon. But it's not totally true, it's not untypical for what Wolf could have done. The songs are very special in so many ways. They have that same intensity or charm that he had. They so portray the words, so that every single word is not only set so the accentuation is absolutely perfect in a way no other composers have done to that degree, but also he captures the meaning of every word, and also, of course, the emotional content of the poem, and he really paints a picture in each lead that he does. He covers in about 300 liter every subject you could imagine, every type of person. He writes about animals. I mean, there's everything represented there. And it's not as if, where some composers, you can feel grief in one song and it's not that different from grief in another song. It may be heartrendingly memorable. But with Wolf, it's like each lead is a whole separate picture and no two expressions of grief or joy or whatever the mood is are ever the same. Each poem can be each poet can be recognized very quickly. If you hear just a few bars of a Wolf song, you know, well, that's going to be a Goethe one. Of course, Goethe being very majestic. He's been likened to a mountain where America is like a meadow. And America is the poetry that really has a lot of humor. And Abschied that you see in the program tonight, I think you'll definitely want to follow the words or it won't mean as much. It's a chance for one to confront their critic. And in fact, at the end, even you can hear that the critic gets kicked down the stairs in the poem. Wolf also could so capture a charm, which you will hear in Dem Schattenmein Walken from the Spanish secular book. The Mignon is a Goethe poem, so you can certainly hear the depth of that. The Miracle ones are Verlassene Meglein, Arists, about spring, Abschied, the one I already referred to, and then Wenn du mein Liebster is from the Italian book. And the Italian book is all about love. Usually the women are complaining about their men, and usually the men are very admiring of the women in that set of books. And the last one, Morgenstimmung, I think is very appropriate for tonight. We opened with a prayer, and you're a wonderful school of such great values. And Wolf captured a great spirituality in this piece, and I hope that you follow the words of it as well. That's what we've chosen to conclude with tonight.